Hey, Crystal. How's it going, love?
Hey, all is well.
Good, good. We got a few more minutes before we get started. So
Cool. Glad I caught your email in time.
that was a that was a fluke that normally doesn't happen, but yeah, it's kind of weird. Someone saw me with the t-shirt on earlier today, my Claudine shirt, and they've been missing sessions for a minute. So
Oh, okay.
right. So this
Nice.
is this is actually an older session that I'd done some time ago, but I updated it to include some new information in it. And so it's still part of the courses that we're doing. We just Acumen is taking off, so we got some other stuff that we're doing that kind of made us push um, the classes, the course that was going on every Sunday. Had to push it back. We got to postpone it. So, but this was just eating at me like, ah, I got to go ahead
Okay,
and do
good.
it.
And
So
yeah, I tagged you in that article because I knew that that information was wrong. So I wanted you to know that.
thank you. And I went ahead and took my comment back down. They changed it because initially they said that California was the first.
Right.
And it's like, no, California is the third. Inside the article, it says the third. So they had to, I just told them, y'all got to change this headline. It's like, and I, was tagging the Acumen stuff and it was like, Shantella, just stop. Just like, just wait. Just let them, once I read the article, it's like, yeah, they're kind of on to what it is, but it's a lot of information they missing just because they're trying to do it like it's a current event.
Okay,
And
gotcha.
it's like, this is not a current event type of deal. You know,
Right.
this is something that's just every time you pull a layer back, something else pops up. And it's odd also, Chris, because I've been trying to get a hold of Maxine Waters' office to see if I can get a comment from her and some other people. Like, we got black representatives, and I haven't heard them say anything. So
Right.
the whole congressional black caucus, it was like every state pretty much had a eugenics program, and black people were the targets. So it's like, can we, see if we can make this work? But
Mm-hmm.
that just kind of threw me. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start because it's absolutely 8 o'clock, and so
Okay.
Chris, don't even worry about. I'm not worried about who's here. I just want to make sure that we're able to put this link up to share with folks as we go. So
Gotcha.
this is Dr. Shantella Sherman, and I want to welcome you all to what is basically a drop-in session that I'm doing really, really quickly to discuss eugenics and popular culture. This is a segue into many of the courses that we do specifically related to the PopU, which is popular eugenics in television, film, and current events. Because now we're starting to see a lot of eugenic themes streamed. We're starting to see a lot of eugenic themes in television, film series, and in news items that are coming forward as if they're, well, I guess technically they are current events now, but they're basically segues to a lot of historical information that we have overlooked, we've pushed to the side, or we've misinterpreted. And so today, I was actually out wearing my Claudine shirt, my T-shirt with that represents one of the films that we use as the onset for our popular eugenics in television and film series. And I had someone come up and ask me about the film, told me they loved the film. They had a lot of questions about the film and all of that. So um, they kind of made me think about, okay, I may need to do an impromptu session. It won't be long, but just to put some of this information before you. And then as you go find the film and stream it, I keep telling folks it's a 1974 film, but many of the things in this film are current. And we have to understand that it's not just what's past as prologue. History is a living, breathing entity, and we carry it on us. We carry it in our memories, we carry it in our behaviors, we carry it in most of the things that we do, but concretely we carry them in our laws. And so in a civil society, what we start to understand is that if we don't understand the past, a lot of the things that we believe that we're fighting currently, we're not really wasting our time, but we're going in circles. And so the goal with Acumen is always, number one, to inform you, but also to give you the tools to try and reform the systems that are oppressive, or to reform yourselves for that matter. Because many of the things that we talk about with eugenics, they start and end with individual people. All right. And so with that, please, when you have a moment, go to the Acumen Group's website. You'll have all of that information at the end of this presentation. But get to know us. And we court all things historical, whether it's Black, white, here in this country, if it's global, if there are different movements, we know about them. And so we have a wonderful group of folks that we work with. They're scientists, they're lawyers, they're business people, but they're all learned. And their job is to ensure that you have the information and the tools that you need to push forward and to live your best life. So with that, we're going to kick off this session of Disrupting Eugenic Stereotypes, and we're going to talk about the film Claudine. I have maybe one or two clips in here that we'll go through, but what we're really focusing on is how the film Claudine continues to inform how the system views Black women's reproductive rights and romantic relationships some 40 years since the film actually was released. And I did get I have about 5 or 6 questions that came into the inbox since I announced that I was doing this kind of impromptu around 3 or 4 o'clock this afternoon. So I will get to those as we get through some of the little lessons that we have here. In the meantime, anyone that's on here, if you want to chime in, if you have comments or questions, please feel free to ask them as we go along. Okay, first and foremost, eugenically speaking, you need to understand what eugenics is. It's a small word, but it's scary to a lot of people because they simply don't understand it. And it sounds really, really scientific, and it sounds as if it's something that's kind of outside the purview of the average person. The lay language of it is not conducive to people actually understanding what it means or its significance, let alone its scope. All right, so just a briefer here. Eugenics was considered to be the science of better breeding, and it's an agrarian term that basically meant, in the same way that a person who works on a farm could take different types of seeds to cross-pollinate them to create the best possible plants, vegetation, or attempt to breed animals in order to have the best possible animal breeds. It was believed that you could also do this with humans. All right, so that's the basis for this. Now, within that scope, not really understanding DNA and genetics as we do now, the folks around 1820, 1830 also determined, when they thought in terms of eugenics, that it's not just about eye color or hair texture, weight, height, things like that that's transferred in the DNA, but also a concept that your condition is transferred in your DNA. So things like poverty, things like immorality, laziness, criminality, any types of behaviors could be considered transmittable within your genes, and they would be transmitted not just from one generation to the next and then stop, but they would transfer for 10 or more successive generations. Meaning, if you had a person who was an alcoholic, or who had children out of wedlock in one generation, it meant that it was in your DNA, it's attached to it, and it's immovable for the next 10 generations or so. And based upon this type of language and this type of belief, you actually had our nation, our wonderful nation, to decide that they could preemptively keep people who they considered to be less than or contaminated from having children, or to segregate them in certain spaces where it would keep them from breeding and having additional children, so that you could cut off that gene pool. Within that same vein, the issue was never just clearly black and white. It absolutely was black and white, but also the concept was the fit over the unfit. And you'll understand this as we kind of go through the courses. And I recommend that, even though this is just a short little teaser, that you understand that fit over unfit means that when we get to African American populations, you will also have this exact same language that's reproduced, so that you have Black people who actually accept or kind of reformulate eugenic theories in order to determine who's the best and brightest among us. So we also have the concepts of fit and unfit that work within African American cultures, within Native American cultures, within Jewish cultures. And so each person or each group then kind of takes on this already fallible, ridiculous science, and decide to make it their own in certain ways. So they determine who is fit among them. Now, based upon this, unfortunately, it means that we've segregated some of the best and brightest among us. And in order to keep these people from contaminating the gene pool, there are only 2 or 3 things that you can do. You can segregate that population for the entire length of their breeding lives, meaning you would put them in a prison, or you would put them in a carceral state in an insane asylum, where if they went in at 18 or 19 years old, you would not let them out until they were basically beyond their reproductive years. So maybe in their 50s or 60s, you may determine you can let them out at that point. This is one of the things that we talk about today when we talk about mass incarcerations. Um, Part of that is considered to be a eugenic construct, because we're picking up young Black men and young Latino men at the age of 14, 15, 16 years old in many instances. And instead of sending them to juvenile spaces, we're sending them into adult prisons and giving them sentences of 20, 30, and 40 years, which means by the time they do leave these prisons, and they're terribly traumatized with that caging process and that institutionalization, they come out and it's like the likelihood of them actually reproducing at that point is very, very slim. So a prison space in and of itself is considered to be a eugenic platform to ensure that the worst among us does not breed and does not have children. So officially, the eugenics movement began in roughly 1840. It gained momentum. And by the time we get to the turn of the century and into the 1920s, we have a fully sanctioned space where county by county and state by state, 33 states officially adopted eugenic legislation for sterilizations and to keep the poor, or what they consider to be socially or morally defective people, which is a very ubiquitous term. The phrasing is such where, depending on who you come across, you may be considered defective, or you may be considered okay, or you may be considered immoral, or you may be considered at risk. Any of these terms was likely to get you placed in a prison, an almshouse, a reformatory, a training school, a prison, and then at that point you would face sterilization. So this is important when we start talking about Claudine, because I always point out that while I love the film, and at its on its surface, it talks a lot about, and it deals with a couple. It's dealing with 2 grown people, Claudine Price, Rupert Marshall. What you're really dealing with is the children. You're dealing with the children that she already has, the children he already has, and basically the system's input in trying to keep this woman from having additional children, but also to kind of monitor her sexuality and to monitor her breeding practices. And so we have to look at that, and also how the system within the film, they're using certain determinate language so that you understand that the issue is about these 6 children that this woman has. So the Black female body, just really briefly, it's never been separated from its labor, meaning the work that the woman does or its ability to reproduce. So it's the laboring of Black women's bodies that makes Black women troublesome and problematic in many instances. So sociologist Lauren Berlant calls it the slaves to bodies, basically sensual and public on the one hand, but vulnerable, invisible, forgettable on the other. And we'll deal with the concept of invisibility when we talk about Claudine and we kind of move forward, because in as much as she is seen, she is only seen through her children, through this man, and in the system as a problem. But it, even the film doesn't really get into um, the her womanhood. I think they kind of scratch upon it a little bit, but then it's kind of overshadowed in some places by the the relationship with Rupert. And so you don't get a chance to see Claudine by herself very much. And I think that, I guess for a woman with 6 kids, who's unmarried at this point and trying to work off the books as a maid, and also trying to skirt the welfare system, who's sending social workers to her house unexpectedly to spy on her and determine if there's a man hanging out in her house. At the same time, managing the children, I don't know that there would be space for her to have private time. But I think that that's one of the things that we see in the film. If you haven't seen the film, go see it. Again, this is a teaser for it. You will get a few spoilers from me. But there's one scene where Claudine goes on a date with Rupert, and it's their first date. And she decides she's going to take a bath and change her clothes to go out on the date with him at his home. He runs a bath for her, and he puts in the dishwashing liquid so that she can have bubbles and luxuriate like, a woman really should after a hard day. And she gets in that bathtub and she falls asleep. And so that for me was a very telling space, where this woman is just so used to having something pinning and pushing or pulling at her, that in a stranger's home, she could actually disrobe, get into a bathtub, and fall asleep within minutes of getting in there, because all of a sudden she has quiet and she has peace. And I think it would have been really, really interesting to see how that formulaically could have been played with a little bit more. But of course, that was 1974. And at that point, I was about 4 years old. So I couldn't be there to add these notes. And I still think that the folks who did it did an amazing job. A Black woman's social value grew out of her ability to use her body as either a laboring tool or in the production of children, either for the benefit of labor or as social currency within the Black community. And so we'll also start to see, again, when we pull back, there's a whole list of textbooks or historical books that frame these ideas, but the concept as we move forward, a Black woman up until the 1970s, if she were a certain age and she did not have children, she was suspicious to the Black community. And so when you start to look at this shift between a Black woman's children being her currency as not only a person, but as a woman, as a member of the community, having that shift to a point where you start to have Black women who literally say, in order for me to be successful as an American, in order for me to be successful and upwardly mobile, in order for me to be a professional Black female, the one thing I don't want is to have children. And so you start to see this shift right around the time that Claudine comes out in 1974, but there's a ongoing push about getting Black women on birth control. And so that's, again, a part of this whole cultural space, social space that we have to look at when we look at Claudine and literally start to pull back some of these layers. Because her body was considered the site of dysgenic reproduction, US laws link Black women's laboring to her morality. And it's a belief that she is inherently inferior in her genes. And basically, when Black women reproduce, it's an ongoing concept right now of not just having Black children in daycare centers or pre-K, but to get the children as soon as possible, because it's believed that Black women are inherently dysgenic and that they don't know how to care for their own children. And so you actually need this outside government official type of body to determine how this child is going to be reared. Because if the child is left in the home of the parent too long, the child becomes basically a throwaway. All right. And you can expect the crime and the whatever they're seeing in that parent's home, or whatever is being passed from that parent to that child. We get into a whole concept of nature versus nurture. Can you offset the genes of the child by ensuring that it goes into a daycare center early? That, again, is something that we discuss in the larger course. And so I don't want to get into that too much, but that's kind of the language that started to be, it was being used as early as the 1840s, 1850s. And so we have to understand, when we see these things and we hear these things, or we see policies set in 2021, they have a long and storied history, and they have systems. I want to keep saying that. They have systems behind them. They have the legal system. They have the educational system. They have the housing system. They have the food systems. They have all of these other systems in place to ensure that Black women really don't have authority, number one, over their own bodies, and certainly not over their children. And so when we look at eugenics for the Acumen group specifically, and through my research, I break it down into three platforms: scientific, social, and popular. And so for scientific, we're talking medicine and research. When we're talking social, it's housing, education, law, and law enforcement. We're talking civics, which is voting and citizenship. Public and social health, which deals with disease and addiction issues and things like that. And then population control. And then finally, marriage and family under that social heading, because there was a time when if you could not pass, they didn't necessarily call them IQ tests, but these Binet tests, these Goddard tests, if you couldn't pass a test that showed that you were mentally fit, you were denied a marriage license. So I need Black people to understand that if you have grandparents or great grandparents who were not married, it wasn't that they wanted to shack up. It was that the county that they lived in simply refused to give them a marriage license. And so they stayed together and lived together and did everything, had children with each other, but it automatically, number one, made the union, um, just nothing that could be legitimate. And then it also made the children that they had considered illegitimate out of wedlock. And so based upon those two criteria alone, any children that these folks had would automatically be targeted for any type of reproductive sterilization because it was considered that they were in an immoral household. And so again, when we do the class, we'll get into the actual laws state by state and county by county that deal with this. But this is something that we need to understand. Many of us don't know our own people because we don't know the laws and the things that governed them, and kind of lock them into certain spaces. And so it's important that we kind of pull those back. The final category is popular. And popular eugenics for me, I would say it's the easiest to kind of push forward. And I think it's easier to explain in many instances. But we start to deal with national norms, what's considered acceptable for your height, for your weight. And so to some extent, it crosses back over. These categories crisscross, back and forth across each other. But what you start to see is that in elementary schools, you had teachers looking for what was called a physical stigmata. And basically, if the child was considered too tall to be in kindergarten, or if the child's ears were considered too big, or the child's nose was considered to be too big or too small, you had folks who were actually looking to see if the child looked as if they had some type of deficiency that was genetic that would keep them from learning, as opposed to them just not being able to keep up with the information. And if it was determined that that child had some type of genetic component, they were automatically taken out of that school and sent to an almshouse, reformatory, asylum, or some other place where they would be tested again. And at that point, it would be determined whether or not they should be sterilized. Please understand, there are conflicting stories. My own archival research shows that the earliest sterilization of a child was at age 3. I do see records that say 7. I've seen some that say 9. At any rate, these children are absolutely not sexually active. They are absolutely not showing signs of dysfunction or just geneticism. It was basically, again, the concept of a physical stigmata, or they're in a household where the folks in the house are doing something that's considered to be immoral or antisocial or pathological, and either a medical body or a judge basically came in and said, these kids need to be removed for their own safety. And once they're removed, we don't want them to reproduce and end up having children that will do the same things that the parents or grandparents have done. Television, film, radio, advertising, books, magazines, and social media all play a part in popular eugenics. And it's basically what we're ingesting every day, all day, from the time we get up in the morning till the time we go to bed. And you can see it in things like beauty contests, games, and aesthetics. So when you wake up in the morning, or you turn your radio on, you turn your television on, if you immediately start being bombarded with folks who are telling you, you can look better, you can get this fixed, You can have your hair look like this, or you need X, Y, and Z to be considered normal. What you're actually listening to is a eugenic stream trying to explain to you that somehow you are deficient. And anytime someone tells you that you can take a pill, an ointment, um, some type of tonic to change things. Years ago, they used to actually have it on the label in some advertising that said, you know, change your DNA, change your germ plasm. When you have a moment, look that up. Germ plasm. Germ plasm it was like a catch-all, cure-all term that was being used on all medication, even if it was just these fly by night, basically alcohol in a bottle type deals where they basically trying to get you to pay for medication. It's not really medicine. And the belief is that there's something inherently wrong, though, genetically with you that's causing you to be or feel or do things. And if you take this tonic, that all goes to the wayside. So again, we have to be really, really careful and cautious. And I think that as we push forward and you start to pull these layers back, unfortunately, it will cause you to look at everything that you watch on television in a new way. Cutting off reproduction, the average number of children born to slave women was 9. This increased to an average of 11 in rural and southern areas. And you can also understand that when we think in terms of the Great Migration, I love Isabella Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. One of the things I always say is that it really spotlights the positive and that survival mechanism that kicks in. One of the things that I look at in my research, however, is that many of these rural Southern families that migrated north moved back, or they moved from one city to another city because they could not quite get their bearing. And it wasn't what, psychologists, black and white, term disorganization, the disorganization of being from a Southern family. The South was considered to be just an abyss of dysgenic black people because they were around dysgenic white people. And so based upon that, this migration meant that all of a sudden, these very sophisticated African Americans who had moved to the city, and they were city slick and they knew about the city and they had their stuff together, all of a sudden they're being crushed by a wave of Black people who are coming to the city, who are not wearing shoes, their hair is looking different, their clothes don't look as sophisticated, they haven't been educated in the same school systems. And so basically you start a whole different set of norms that basically put migrating Black people in a space where they were targets of all types of reproductive mayhem. And so when we get to 1974, the year that Claudine was released, the average had decreased among urban Black people to 7. And basically, if you had those 7 kids, social workers were on your backs constantly trying to get those numbers decreased by the next generation. So it's always odd and it's ironic when you look at the 1974 numbers and then you look at the 1984 numbers. That number completely starts to shift down to you start having, instead of 7 kids, there are 4 kids. And then when you get to 1994, instead of 4 kids, there are only 2 kids. And so it's this push, this ironic push, this overwhelming push to get Black families who migrated to the city, who basically have quote unquote poverty as a part of their DNA strand, keep them from reproducing kids. And if you can lock them up and put them in prison and keep them from reproducing during their reproductive years, if you can push birth control off on them as quickly as possible, or if you can confine them to an asylum and then sign them off to have them sterilized, reproductively sterilized, then you do that. But it worked. In many instances, it absolutely worked. Pop culture leads the way. So again, when we look at those 1974 numbers, you see a complete shift. But if you think of what was on television at this point, you had Leave It to Beaver, you had Father Knows Best, The Courtship of Eddie's Father. And at this point, in a social workers kind of push, you have what's known as the 2 children household model. And you start to hear people say, we want a house with a white picket fence, 2.5 kids, and a dog named Rex. All right. And that becomes the model when we move into this 1970, 1975 era. One of the things that happened then, and that's one of the questions that came up, in the little mailbag was, what was it about 1974 that became just a crushing year, where it was felt like um, many of the things that were seen in the film Claudine were actually happening in real life, and there needed to be some type of answer in the film to this. But at the same time, there was a lot going on legislatively. And I'll tell you, number one, you had the first instance of the ACLU kind of getting involved and determining that you needed to have informed consent for sterilizations. Previously, 1907, when the first sterilization laws were written, up through 1924, 1927, when you start to have the Supreme Court get involved and you have Buck versus Bell. Essentially, what's said is, if the courts determine that a person is socially inept, and again, what does that mean? If it's determined that this person is poor, if they have children, the children will be poor. If they're not particularly brilliant, if they're going to be blue collar workers, and if they're going to be, again, wayward in the sense that you can't control them having sex with people outside of wedlock, or they're going to have sex with people of a different race, which was critical at this point, since we're talking white supremacy at its utmost. The one thing you wanted to do was ensure that they could not have children at all. And so we have the Ralph sisters, Mary Alice, was one of them. They're 12 and 14-year-old girls. They're in Alabama. And essentially what happens, a social worker comes through and says, there have been too many boys hanging around the back door of this house. And so we've determined that the girls need to be brought in first and foremost for Gardasil shots. Um, it was determined after about 5 or 6 months of them taking Gardasil shots every month, that the Gardasil shots were toxic. Social worker comes back and picks them up, takes them to the hospital. And at 12 and 14 years old, the girls were taken in for a sterilization process. Jet magazine, Ebony magazine, everyone goes through, they, this is an outrage, da 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 da. But at this point, ACLU and other legal bodies get involved, and they say, well, the parents signed off on it. No, the parents hadn't, because the parents could not write their names and could only sign with an X. So the signature that you actually see of the parents' names written out clearly determines that the signature was fraudulent. But a 12 and 14-year-old girls had both been sterilized at this point. So the informed consent laws that we exercise and we use today were based upon this 1974 ruling off of these two sisters. And so it's, again, Minnie and Mary Alice, Ralph, and it's important that we understand pulling those layers back. Also, 10 years before this, 1964, the state of Mississippi had designed laws to ensure that any Black person that was trying to seek their civil rights just couldn't do it. All right. So as the population is starting to still shift up, you still have Black women in the South who are having children. Again, you're keeping them from getting marriage licenses. So the pregnancies are technically out of wedlock. So 1964, the state of Mississippi comes up with a full-scale law that says any woman inside the state, any girl who has a baby out of wedlock, is guilty of a felony. And that felony it holds a custodial charge, a custodial sentence of 3 to 5 years in prison. And the only prison they were sending you to, and we know this if you're from Mississippi, if you've been down there, is Parchman Prison. So most young girls, if they, found out that they were pregnant, they didn't want to go to Parchman Prison. And the only way that you could sidestep that custodial charge, you still have the felony on your record, but the only way to sidestep that felony charge was to go in and be sterilized. And so this became the law. And so again, when we do the class, you'll see the actual documents. You'll see every senator and congressman who pushed the law in, wrote the law up, signed off on the law, and then went through the process of ensuring that it was enforced through the public health system. So as soon as these girls had babies, they did not want the midwives to deliver the babies. They now wanted to have public health workers, who were mostly white men, to come in, see that the children were born, and then have whoever was registering the births of the children to report back to the police and just let them know this girl was not married, The baby is now 30 days old. You can go and try and enforce this and basically lock her up, or take her in to have her sterilized. Now, based upon what the senators and congressmen said as they were pushing this legislation forward, um, the entire point of the legislation was to ensure that the number of Black women who were still having babies in the South did not think that they were equal to. And so they weren't equal to white people. And since you start to have the numbers increase on the Black side, but not have the numbers increase on the white population side, the belief was that, once again, dysgenically, those who are weaker are going to overpower and outnumber those who are considered to be superior. And eventually you're going to have a problem like we're having today. I don't mind saying that, where all of a sudden we're concerned about who's voting and who's not voting. Always follow the political line of sight, always follow the social line of sight, and you'll start to see some of these eugenic laws and rules resurface again and again. All right, so there are a couple of clips I want to get to with this. The first is Love and Poverty. I'm going to see if this plays out. Let's see if we can. I don't know if I can collapse y'all. Wait a minute. But I did that. Sorry. Wait a minute. Mhm. Mhm. Okay, just as you can see, the teaser um, years ago did not necessarily call for people to pay attention. It didn't call for people to go, oh, this is a story about these kids and what happens in um, what it is that they're doing. It doesn't touch on that at all. And so I think that again, at the time that the film came out, the push was the fact that you had James Earl Jones, amazing actor. You had Diane Carroll, who was Miss Regal and Miss Elegance herself, playing a welfare mother of 6 kids. And Rupert, James Earl Jones is playing a man who's sidestepping the responsibility of 3 different children, all in different spaces. So 2 kids with one woman, a third child with someone else. And it looks like, again, on the surface, it's really about, again, the love project that the announcer talks about, but it is the 6 children that really get to the heart of the eugenic scope of what it is that they're talking about. Let me see. This next one is about policing, again, the black woman's body. Let me see. I see we need to get some sound up. Let's see if we can make this a little bit louder for you. You understand. That's it. Okay, and again, I think what you start to see is that one, you get a scope of that fit over unfit. Because one of the things that a lot of people walked away with starting out is that the social worker, Miss Quebec, is a white woman. And so it comes off extremely racialized when Miss Quebec shows up to her house. She goes through her bathroom, she goes through the closets. She wants to see if a man has been coming to the house to visit her. And what she says is, your neighbors have reported that a man has been visiting you regularly. So you start to also understand that it's not just um, an issue where you have this group of white people and this system of whiteness that's coming in to attack poor black people. It's other black people, her neighbors, who are reporting her, number one. And then number two, when they decide they're going, Rupert and Claudine decide that they're going to go to the social workers and try and sit down and work out, if he marries her, what can happen, so that he can be in the house, he can be a positive influence on the children. Can he be in the house without marrying her, without it being considered immoral? or if they get married, financially, what would his responsibilities be in relation to taking care of the kids and taking care of her? When you start to see who Miss Kback's boss is, the amazing Roxy Roker, who we know from the Jeffersons, is her boss. So she has a Black woman who's telling her what to do at this point. So you start to understand these are systemic issues that race does play a part in it, in the sense that you have a large body of Black people that you're constantly being taught to believe are the majority of people on welfare. But you have Black people all within the system as social workers, as policymakers. And the issue is the fit over the unfit, and ensuring that this woman doesn't continue to have kids that the taxpayers have to pay for. And so it comes off as extremely strong handed unless you get an inside glimpse. And I think that that's what the film was attempting to do with this, to give you kind of an inside glimpse of what it looks like to be a mother of this many kids. And, you know, there's several scenes where she explains she had already had 2 marriages and she had been engaged twice. And in each one of these instances, it was a situation where the men determined that they could not afford to stay with her because they could not, even if they loved her, they could not afford to pay for the upkeep of the children. And so the children become the burden, the children become the issue throughout this entire film. And so you really, really have to pay attention to that. The last scene deals with generational love lessons. And the pivotal point of this, before I show this, Claudine's oldest son, the 6 kids, Charles, Charlene, Patrice, Paul, I have to always remember the little one who wants to be invisible all the time. Lurleen is the little girl. And then basically you have these kids where the oldest son, who's been there the longest, he's 18 years old. He's kind of seen his mother go through this process of falling in love with men, the men staying for a while and then leaving. He determines in the scenes previous to this that he does not want to have to go through this in his life. And at 18, he decides to have a vasectomy. And so as this scene is closing out, you start to see where he's just kind of put in a dilemma as to whether or not he made the right decision in having a vasectomy. But again, children become the burden. And even though it seems extremely extreme, you understand in watching this, the mental and emotional turmoil that her children are going through, because they're believed to be burdens on the system, and basically wrecking their mother's lives, their mother's life, because they're there, you know. And so it's important, I think, to kind of take a peek at that as well. So here we go. Mhm. I'm gonna close that scene out right there. It gets into the actual close of the movie, and I may go back to that. But I love the fact that again, this conversation starts to center around the fact that the system pushes Black men out of the household and then blames the woman for having to raise the kids by herself. And so you'll start to, the actual research on this, you'll see that in spaces like Chicago and Detroit, you had instances where public housing that was being newly built, the requirement from social workers was in order for a woman to move in, a family to move in, if they had more than 2 or 3 children, they could move in, but the father, the husband, could not stay there. And in Detroit specifically, they actually had legislation that said he could not be in the state. He had to leave the state altogether. So, they didn't want to run the risk that the father, the husband of this woman, the father of those kids was coming back to the household and still spending time with his kids. It was like, if we're going to take on the responsibility of putting you in decent housing, we want to ensure that we are in control of your household, in control of this woman, and in control of these kids. And so that's the song that Gladys Knight is singing, Mr. Welfare. Mr. Welfare becomes your dad. All right, that becomes your husband. And so the belief is, you don't answer to anyone other than Mr. Welfare. He can cut your money off. He can get you put out of public housing. And so you start to disregard these men. And again, their only function, when you hear James Earl Jones say, I don't understand how, we got this rule where all of a sudden, as the papa, as the breadwinner, if I don't have that bread, I can't come around. Most children would tell you, if you're there, it's more important for you to be there, for me to see you there, to see what you're doing, um, than for you not to be there. So your presence is not your money. But you start to see this. If you can see this playing out in 1974 in this film, then you understand when we're looking at it in 2021, just how long we've been dealing with this type of issue. And so we get to the Moynihan report. Daniel Moynihan, by the way, he conscripted, stole, boosted much of the information from his report from E. Franklin Frazier. And E. Franklin Frazier's information came out late 30s, late 1940s, where he was looking at Black families in Chicago by sitting in family courts and basically taking notes from the dockets to determine how the families were being run, how Black families were being managed. And he found out that in many instances, it was these women, because the men could not stay there and because the men could not find jobs or were being kept from having jobs, that the women had to take on the responsibility of both mother and father, but also they had to, in some instances, leave the children on their own. And so you'll hear a lot about Black women working either as days workers or working in white people's homes where they have to stay overnight. And if they're staying overnight, they're leaving their children by themselves, or they're leaving their children vulnerable to whatever else might be outside in those neighborhoods that's watching them not being taken care of. So Moynihan in his report says, in essence, the Negro community has been forced into a matriarchal structure, which, because it is so out of line with the rest of American society, retards the progress of the group. But when you say the Negro community has been forced into it, you need to answer, forced by whom? And so I was really, kind of teed off with Moynihan and his side of it, even though E. Franklin Frazier, a Black man, when he did his initial book, and it's on the Black family, the Negro family, he looks at the disorganization of Black people migrating from the South to the North alone. So if you have a woman come up by herself, or you have a man come up by himself to get settled, and he leaves his wife and his kids behind, chances are he'll end up with a second family in the space where he is. Or if you have a woman come up by herself, sometimes she's at the mercy of unscrupulous people, and she ends up, having babies out of wedlock, not because she's promiscuous, but because she has a rapist who she works for when she's working as a maid. Right. So those types of things are not taken into consideration when we look at the reproductive lives of these women. So I think again, it's important to pull Claudine back a little bit and start to look at how she ended up with those 6 kids. Ironically, that is one of the scenes that was pulled from both the DVD and every Blu-ray that's been released on Claudine. There were 2 original scenes that were pulled out of it, and one of them was Claudine talking to her daughters alone, where she's having this conversation about the love is when a man brings the groceries instead of eating yours. Love is not something that she even talks about. It's not in that fantasy mode anymore, because the reality is the kids are the consequence of her being, in love or being with men. So she doesn't look at it as something that's a positive. And when one of her daughters, the oldest one, says she wants to get married, she said, well, let me know when the wedding is so I can make plans not to be there. Because the belief is this is just something where this man is going to get you pregnant. He's not going to be able to stay with you as your husband. And then you're going to be left just like I am with kids that you can't really manage. All right. I do think it's amazing that Claudine goes through a lot to tell constantly this oldest son of hers and anyone who will listen that her children are really all that she has. Um, and so you can see this is Diane Carroll. I've done a number of interviews with her as a journalist over the course of my life before she passed away. And we talked a lot about the film and what it meant. And the fact that at the time that she did this film, her own daughter was roughly 12 years old. And so she talks about the fact in one of the scenes, again, spoilers, the daughter Charlene becomes pregnant and the daughter is 14 in the film. And so she goes through this is a horrendous scene. It's marvelously played. It's hard to watch even now, but it's, when I interviewed Diane Carroll, she said basically it was one take, one scene, and that was it. The scene opened up. She went crazy. She beats the girl with the hairbrush, but she's like, I don't really remember exactly what took place, because all I could think of is what would happen if this were me in reality and this was my 12-year-old daughter. What if this was Suzanne who was having to deal with this? How would I react to it? And she said, I just let go. And what you see on screen is, again, one take, and this is how we did it. So um, again, to think that your daughter is about to have to go through the same process. But when the girl came to her initially and said, I want to get married, she pushed it to the side. I wasn't sure. And again, I think this would have been the one film I would have liked for them to have made a sequel to before the principals began to pass away, because I wanted to see what the reach of it would have been. Because it's an amazing reach and it's an amazing scope. And to look at this 20 years down the line instead of coming to America. I mean, come on, I digress. And again, that final scene, self-imposed sterilization for Charles, was having a vasectomy a case of freedom, or did he just imprison him on his own self? And so you really have to kind of look at that again. Watch the film and you'll kind of see the emotional trauma that he's going through. And, I think the 2 older children, Charles and Charlene, kind of go through a process where they're talking about them being nothing, the nothingness of their existence. The youngest son, Francis, is constantly talking about he wants to be invisible. He doesn't want people to see him. He believes that he's invisible. And so it's not as if he has a mental or emotional problem, but literally, as the fifth of 6 kids, an overtaxed mother, some older brothers and sisters that are just kind of pushing him around or whatever. You can kind of see where he's going with this, but he's not getting enough attention. When you look at the older kids, Charlene kind of going out, hanging out with older men, trying to find herself. But then you look at Charles, and I think he probably had the most powerful and gripping story of the 6 kids, because he felt like he could do something about it. But his character is the one who says things like, sometimes I just sit alone in my room and I cry, and I'm crying for nothing. And I don't really know what's wrong with me. Or, I hate my brothers and sisters. I hate them. Why did you have them? Everything that goes wrong in your life is because of them. And he tells his mother, I knew I didn't have anything, but because of them, I have to share what I don't got. I got to share what I don't even have. And so he looks at his brothers and sisters as a burden, and to think that he chose to have a vasectomy based on the fact that he couldn't see clear of navigating society or navigating the world as a Black man without coming up against what he's seeing Rupert go through and all these other men who've attempted to be with his mother, including his own father. It's a powerful story, and it makes me wonder now how many of the young Black men that we're dealing with today are dealing with the same type of emotional trauma that's not really neglect, but it's invisibility, not really being seen. And so Charles's answer is the vasectomy, but also to become this revolutionary where he's, charging into government buildings and trying to be seen and trying to make sure that he can, affect change. And so again, when I'm looking at young Black men today, whatever it is that they may be doing, one of the questions that I'm asking is this another Charles? Is this someone who's saying, I don't feel like I'm being seen or heard, and I need to take whatever opportunity possible to kind of get out here and make sure that you understand I am here. At the same time, the fact that Charles cuts off his progeny, he cuts off his ability to reproduce and have kids is extremely troublesome. And again, it just makes me wonder, there are tales today, again in 2021, of young Black men and young Black women who are their parents are on public assistance, who are being offered sterilization as an option. And so we really have to look at how many of them are actually taking that option because they believe it's in their hands and it's okay, based upon circumstances that they're going through today, which could easily change tomorrow. I think that this scene where Charles sees that his mother and Rupert and the rest of the kids are now happy, even if it's just temporal, even if it's just temporary, he sees that. And I think this closing frame on his face was just, I can't tell if that's regret or frustration or just overwhelming sadness. But Lawrence Hilton Jacobs, I think, deserves an Oscar 40 years later for the performance that he gave in this film based upon this. Again, more quotes from Diane Carroll just about, many of the things, even though she had money, many of the things that Claudine had to go through, she also went through because she said she was often foolish in her love relationships. And, she has 2 autobiographies, 2 memoirs. If you have a chance to get a peek at them, yeah, a lot of the stuff she did, it was kind of laughable today. And then you kind of look at her and go, you didn't know any better than to do that. But, I think, it makes that case of folks do strange things for love, right? And then finally, I would be remiss. I would just be completely off my rocker if I didn't talk about this soundtrack. I honestly believe that Diane Carroll's film, James Earl Jones' performance, it would not have had the same impact had it not been for Curtis Mayfield writing the lyrics, and Gladys Knight and the Pips doing just the most outstanding job with the soundtrack. I would say this is probably the greatest soundtrack of modern cinematic history. I'll go on record with that for forever, I think. I just think that every single song pinpoints what the characters were going through. There's a dynamic song in there called To Be Invisible. And if you go through the lyrics, it's just, you start to see not just the children being invisible, you see Claudine's invisibility, you see Rupert's invisibility, you see Black people's invisibility. Curtis Mayfield, I think, just had his hand on the pulse of what Black people needed to say and didn't feel like they could articulate at that point. And of course, we had already had Shaft and the other soundtracks that he had done. He was just amazing, all across the board. But with this, whether it was, the Mr. Welfare song, there are just a number of I don't think there's a single song on it that doesn't hit his point. And so again, I would urge you to take the time to screen the film, take the time to ask some questions about what it is that you're seeing, and to absolutely get into this soundtrack. The soundtrack is in my iPod. And I'm still playing this like it's 1974. So, that's that. All right. If you have questions, since this is most of the folks that we know here, you can type them in. Or if you want to show yourself, you can do that. Also, I have 3 additional questions that came in from the little mailbag. So I'm going to start going through those. If you have a question, then holler out to me. You say that the film is not about the adults as much as it is about the kids. How does eugenics play out with each of the children? Okay, well, briefly, I just talked about Charles and Charlene. Um, Patrice, the little girl, she's just a smart aleck. I mean, she's just all over the place. And again, you can tell, if she stays the straight and narrow, this child may be okay. But she's just the tattletale, and she tends to tear her little brother up. He seems to be the target of whatever it is that she may be going through. Paul, the middle son, Paul has been truant from school. So one of the things that shows itself eugenically is the school system has told Paul, you're math deficient. You have no math potential. And I really like the fact that they're using that language, no math potential, meaning it's no need in even getting you a tutor. You don't even have the potential of learning this information. The odd thing is he decided to skip out of school because the teacher embarrassed him by saying that, but he's on the street in an alley playing dice. And Rupert comes to find him. And when he does, Rupert asks him, so, how's your game been going? He didn't scold him. He just, how's your game been going? This kid starts adding and dividing. I started out with this. I made a double. I did this. I did that. And he says, your teacher told you have no math potential, but you've just added, subtracted, multiplied, and divided all in your head with no paper. And so don't let other people push you out of the spaces where you're supposed to be. That's one of those instances, once again, where the system is saying one thing, it is absolutely eugenically defined. But because you have this one Black man who shows up, who's older than him, who says, no, you can do this. And I've just watched you do it. And I believe you got this knocked out. The kid goes back to school. The other thing about Paul, though, is that he's, again, a bit of a smart aleck, and the kids are cursing. They those are the original Bebe's kids. But you can see that their mother actually has some type of control over them to some extent. They know right from wrong, even if they're not doing right. And so I think that Paul had the potential, because of the skipping school and the truancy, to fall into that eugenic slope of having to be picked up by truant officers that they had at that time and taken into custody at a prison because he was truant. So, I would hope, again, since we don't have a follow-up on that, that Paul ended up okay. Francis, I thought, would have been the kid with, again, the emotional issues, just because he wanted to be invisible. And again, he doesn't want to necessarily eat, and he doesn't want to do certain things because, he feels like, if I wasn't here, my mother would be happy. Crystal is asking, wouldn't the poor health care from pregnant Black women are receiving and ultimately dying be a modern day form of eugenics? It absolutely can be considered that, Crystal. The idea, again, eugenically, is that we don't know our own bodies. We're too busy, as Claudine said, grinding them babies out for the taxpayers to take care of. Okay, so we're not thinking in terms of eating properly or this, that, or the other. Now, that's somebody in a doctor's coat that's saying that. But the reality of it is, when I started listening to people like the head of the American Psychological Association just last year announce, you could be eating raw garbage and you still end up with a healthy baby, provided your stress levels aren't just absolutely ridiculous. And so what you start to understand is, if under enslavement, you were having healthy babies, if under Jim Crow, you were having healthy babies, what's different now? And so some of this is about stress, and it's about who your physicians are. Some of this is about the fact that you have folks who don't have cultural competencies, who are handling, your prenatal, your pregnancy, your postnatal. And so, you know, that goes directly to that. So one of the articles that, thank you, Linda Way Villicasi wrote for Acumen talks about the fact that switch the numbers around. Instead of talking about the women who are having issues with the health system, talk about the 100% number of Black women who have positive outcomes when they have Black physicians. All right. So is the issue the Black woman, or is the issue the physician and the system that she's dealing with? All right. Because we've been big in Black all this time, and we've been unhealthy in Black all this time, and we've been stressed to some degree all this time. So tell me what's different. I think that sometimes that right there will tell you whether you're dealing with a eugenic trope that just is stuck. It's stuck. If I keep telling you this right here is unfit and it's not natural and this, and this, then you believe it to such an extent that when you start to see Black women who are fine and they are healthy and they are having babies, we've seen, you know, we're working on this thing about the crack epidemic, drug epidemics that have gone on. And these women had babies that were less than a pound when they were born. And the children 25 and 30 years later are fine, healthy, you know, members of society. They're brilliant, this, and this. So you have to be able to look at something else other than just that. Sophia's asking, is there anything eugenic about how Charles went to find Rupert at the bar? I think it was less him going to find him. You know, he had already told him, they butted heads, and he basically just told Rupert, my mother has had men coming in since I was a little kid. Again, as the oldest child. And Claudine was married to his father. All right. So to have had your father in the house, you have to understand how this older boy feels about the fact that he doesn't like these men necessarily in his territory anyway. All right. And then all of them kind of make these promises, and they, you know, I'm going to take your mother out and it's going to be, you know, this, and this, and I'm going to do this for her and yada, yada, yada. And then he understands that at some point these men disappear. So he had already warned Rupert, every tear my mother sheds is going to cost you a quart of blood. And Rupert's like, yeah, okay. Like, I don't intend to go anywhere. But the more serious the relationship became, the more he started feeling like he was being trapped. You know, so Rupert starts saying, at some point, I only have two options: to break up with you, or to get married to you. And if I try and get married to you, then, you know, the social workers and the welfare people will be, you know, looking at me. It puts me on the line for looking after not just you, who he was happy to deal with, but all 6 of these kids. And so in that particular scene where he's going to Rupert, again, he's already made the statement to his mother and to Rupert in front of him that there are times when I just sit up in my room and I start crying for no reason. And I don't, like, he's feeling the trauma. You know, he's feeling the stress. He's feeling all of this other stuff. So you see when Rupert grabs him and just starts hugging him, he begins to cry again. And so for me, that was extremely pivotal. It was that switch point, because this is an 18-year-old. And you know, we always say when a child gets to be a certain age, oh, they're grown, they don't need their parents. You need your parents until the day you die. That's the way that works. So just having Rupert hold him, you know, and then to have Gladys Knight over in your ear saying, hold him, you know, just hold him for a little while. Just that in and of itself reaffirmed for Charles that he was not only there and alive, but what he had done made a difference. So he literally says to him at that point, you proved your point. And it was only because Charles came and popped him in the jaw and knocked him around a little bit, I think that Rupert got in the car, went over there to this woman to say, okay, this is how I'm going to officially end this, or I'm going to at least explain myself. And I do need to talk to these children because I invested in them and they invested in me. And now I'm pulling out once again. And so again, you know, the fact that they decide to go ahead and get married and they kind of go through this whole thing is brilliant. But Charles showed his masculinity and his manhood by defending his mother, defending her womanhood, defending her motherhood, and taking on James Earl Jones. Because quite frankly, you know, if he was drunk, but he wasn't that drunk. If he wanted to fight him, he probably could have took Charles one way or the other. But, you know, Rupert understood that that wasn't the point. Rupert understood he is trying to show himself. He's trying to be seen. He's trying to make it clear that his masculinity and his manhood are on the line for the sake of his mother. And so I appreciate the fact that the film went through that and they didn't turn it into, just a bunch of cursing and kicking and throwing stuff around. But you get to see Charles cry at that point, and you get to see Rupert hold him fatherly. You get to see this tenderness between the two men. And so that's why I said, again, I thought it would have been brilliant to fast forward this story, after 20 years or after 30 years. And at this point, after 40 years, to try and figure out exactly what happened with that relationship kind of going forward. For the other kids, well, Lurleen, the last kid, the little girl, Lurleen, it was just an average spoiled little kid, I think. And so I didn't really see, eugenically speaking, anything that was going on with her, except the fact that, again, one of the missing scenes from Claudine is a scene where, again, the three daughters are with Claudine and she's combing Lurleen's hair. And Lurleen tells her, you always hurt me when you comb my hair. This is a very Black female space. And she says, you always hurt me when you comb my hair. The older sister jumps in and said, Mama, don't you know you make me feel ugly when you always combing and tearing and pulling at my hair? You made me feel like I wasn't beautiful enough the way I was, and I don't want you doing this to my sister. She stands up for her sister. And she said, well, you want me to just have her going out here looking like anything? Because the kids are a reflection of the mother, and it says something to the outside world and to the social workers if these kids go outside and they don't look a certain way. Absolutely a eugenic statement. Absolutely a eugenic principle. And so the mother and the daughters kind of have this back and forth that they're going through based upon her saying, all of my kids are beautiful, and it's like, okay. And she says, your father, he was fine. And so one of the other girls said, well, what about my father? Yeah, he was fine. One of the other kids, what about my daddy? Yeah, he was fine. The oldest daughter said, yeah, they were all fine. And now they're all gone. So at some point, as beautiful as you are, all of these men still left you. Instead of you talking about us, don't you think this is really about you? So again, I think that between Charles and Charlene, I think they really breached that space with their mother, trying to make her see herself as well. So those were definitely eugenic statements that were kind of going forward. So Sophia, yeah, I think that the scene was less about him coming to fight him in that regard, like we do today. He came to knock him out and beat him up and all that. There needed to be a connection between these two men where you see that they both are vulnerable and they both kind of needed each other at that point. Yeah, keep the questions coming. I have a question. How realistic were the scenes with the social worker showing up at Claudine's home? Yes, it's my understanding that that was absolutely something that happened in the early welfare system. I'm not sure if it's still happening today, but it was very, very common for social workers to not just show up, on a Saturday unexpectedly, but a lot of times they would show up. They had a night shift and they would show up at your house at 2:00 in the morning, catch you off guard and see if there's a man sleeping in your bed. And if they find a man there and they needed to take his information down, they needed to find out where he worked. They needed to, so any man that's just dating you to happen to want to spend the night, all of a sudden is looking like, okay, this is too much of a risk. I'm not trying to lose my job, having a little bit of fun with you. And, I don't want to be responsible for your kids if I'm just dating you and it's really not that serious. So the social workers, these people were very, very diabolical in some instances. Sometimes they would go to a neighbor's house and hang out at the neighbor's house so they could keep looking out the window to see who was coming in and out of your house. They wanted to see if you were buying or purchasing new products. So Rupert's thing as a garbage man, he would find things in the garbage out in this white neighborhood where he was working. They may throw something away that they didn't want, but it's not necessarily broken or out of style or anything. He would take it, clean it up, and give it to her as gifts for her and the children. The problem was every time the social worker came, if there was something new in the house, the social worker would take a notepad and she would try and put a valuation on whatever it was that was in the house and then deduct the amount that she believed the items were worth from the total amount of money that she was giving to Claudine for the upkeep of the kids. So that in and of itself is like, um, it takes away the humanity, of the person that you're dealing with. And that is very true to life as well. I've heard stories of folks where, if there's a female child in the house, the social worker will ask the girls to line up so that she can physically examine them, just kind of look at them, now, to determine if they look as if they are pregnant. Because the other thing is, like with Charlene, once Charlene became pregnant, she could not stay in the house with her mother because now she'll have to be on welfare to some extent, which means you'll end up having two incomes coming into one house, which the social workers didn't want. So when the little girl, Lurleen, tells Rupert, Charles and Charlene are moving out, so there'll only be four of us now. Charlene had to go. Charles decided to go. So, all of a sudden you now have a pregnant 14-year-old who will be in the house by herself or with the father of this child that's coming through. And it'll have to be determined if the welfare is going to take care of Charlene, then her boyfriend, who's calling himself, his name was Teddy and he just changed it to Abdullah, then Abdullah can't stay in the projects with her. He can't stay in housing with her. So once again, you're about to push another Black man out of the house and leave this girl who again is 14 and probably needs her mother now more than ever. You're just kind of leaving her vulnerable and open to whatever happens to come her way. So yes, those scenes were extremely, well, some people found them comical, and you again had this soundtrack that's in your ear, watching them hide items in the house. Um, it was very true to life, and they probably didn't go as far as actual social workers did. They will also do things like go into the bathroom, ask to use the bathroom, so they could check and see if there was a razor or anything that a man may have left in the house. And then they would, based on that, have investigators to kind of come out and set up some tools to kind of determine if there's someone visiting you regularly, and if there is, to get that person's information to ensure that they aren't cheating the government by giving you things that you aren't deducting from your check. And this final question, could Claudine have been sterilized? Um, the quick and easy answer to that is absolutely. Probably most likely what would have happened at 36, when the film opens, she's 36 years old. More than likely, the first threat is that if you have additional children, we'll cut the finances that you are having. So there's usually a breaking point where it's like, we're already giving you, say, $500 a month. If you have an additional child, we won't give you any additional resources. And then very slowly, they'll start to pull even that money back to ensure that you're not just having babies for the taxpayers to have to take care of. And so when you start putting dollar signs on people's heads, you have a whole nother issue. Dr. Sparks is asking, when people brag that they are a generational welfare person, and know how to work the system, how is eugenics playing on their mindset? Well, this is the thing. I think that sometimes, depending on who you ask and how you ask it, you'll get different answers. And here's the reality of it. If you're forcing, and this is white and Black, and so I want to make sure that I do say this. Claudine is set in New York, it's set in Harlem. Again, we're talking about, the 1970s. But this was playing out in West Virginia and Memphis and all places across this country where white people are as well. And so when we talk again about Detroit and Chicago, you actually had housing projects that came up side by side, and they had as many white people in them as they had Black people in them. What they said was, we're going to use the towers, the buildings over here. Those are just for the white people, and these are just for the Black people. The reality is, neither one of the groups had any money. And both of them were under the same conscription. Both of them had the exact same things that were happening to them at the same time. The reality of it was, again, fit over unfit. And so what you start to see is that if I'm going to take the job that you have and pull it from you and send it out so far that you can't get to it, and then I can have, some folks that are moved to the suburbs that we've just built to take those jobs, so that you all of a sudden have an urban inner city of both Black and white, then the system actually set this up to make you generationally poor. All right. So I can't fault people. You telling me that the school system is crumbling and that despite the fact that your children are doing well, the teachers are saying your child is math deficient. The teachers are saying your children have too many behavioral issues. And then once you look at it, it's like, nah, the kids don't really have behavior issues. You're just ill-equipped to deal with children in this era or in this group because you've been teaching for the last 50 years and we don't do it like that anymore, or you think the kids are all hyperactive. It's all of the labeling. um, you're going to have generation upon generation of people who are on welfare. Now this is the thing I say about that, and I want to be clear. All right, if you are happy to marginalize people, then you have to deal with the outcome of them being marginalized. All right. There are whole groups of people, both black and white, who will tell you they've been disenfranchised purposefully. They've been kept from getting the resources that they need. And so they're happy to get what they can at this point. Almost every person that you hear that says that they're generationally, they've been on welfare for 2 or 3 generations, it's not by happenstance. I think that if given the opportunity and access, they would absolutely do different. There are others who say, and I've heard this as well, um, this is the money that you owe my great grandparents. All right. You didn't pay those slaves, but you're going to pay me. I've also heard that. Or I've heard white people say, you brought in all of those immigrants to take the job that I was actually skilled to do. And so I have no way of making money. And if you're going to pay for me to sit here and do nothing, then not only are you going to pay for me, but you're going to pay for my son and my grandson to also do nothing because you've invited others in, or you've taken the opportunities that were supposed to be mine as a citizen. And you basically set up different systems. You set up tests and you set up, deplorable housing or education or whatever else to ensure that I'm not going to pass the ACT. I'm not going to pass the SAT. I'm not, I may not even make it through high school. So what are my alternatives? All right, because now we've automated everything. So I absolutely understand your point, Dr. Sparks, but I also think that, again, we tend to eliminate the human aspect of this, which is, I don't think anybody wants to be poor on perfect, on person. Or it's like, we're not trying to do this on purpose. You don't want to be someplace where, it's squalor and it's dangerous and there's violence and it's all this other stuff going on. And I understand people do this thing about the habitus. And, when you get into a community and everything starts to seem normal to you, even though it's dysfunctional and pathological, you just accept it and it becomes normal. It is never normal. And that is what you're seeing with Charles and Charlene and the rest of Claudine's kids. It doesn't feel normal. It feels out of place. It feels wrong, but what can you do about it? And so I don't think that the fact that you aren't yelling and jumping up and down and trying to set stuff on fire, I don't think that that means you accept it. I think that that means that you're trying to get along and go along until you can get out. And so, we just have to figure out a way, I think, of realigning these systems so that they understand that they're dealing with people and that the people aren't pathological and just don't want to do right and don't want to do and don't want to do. But you have literally, by your labeling, made it almost impossible for them to access the things that they do need. And then you want to blame them for it. So I have a major problem with that. That was our last question. I'm going to do this real quick. All right. Make sure that you visit and subscribe to the Acumen website. The information is there. Like and follow us on social media. There's the Facebook and the Twitter account. And if you have additional questions, please fall back, ask them, because again, I think that whenever we do any type of race or eugenics studies, the two films I will always go to first and foremost is Claudine, when we're looking at women and children and sometimes masculinity, and then A Soldier's Story, to deal specifically with manhood and masculinity issues, tropes of masculinity. And so we have to be able to pull these things apart in order to get a better understanding, or we're just kind of going around in a circle um, back and forth with this. Um, are there any additional questions? Anybody? 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 Okay. I'm gonna see if this scene will play out all the way. And I'm gonna close out with this. When it ends, then we just wave to each other. I want to see if the wedding scene will continue or if it can I make it go forward. Nope. Let's see. I just want to get you to the wedding so you can actually see them do what they do. All right. Okay, I do want you to notice though that the one person the police ran into the house to arrest is the one person that wasn't on the back of the paddy wagon by the time they closed that scene out, which was a little bit odd and crazy. But again, I want to thank you all for joining me today. Again, this was just a teaser for the larger course and the larger class that deals with popular eugenics and television, film, and current events. And again, Claudine is always our starting point when we kick off the rest of the coursework. This again will be one of the films that we watch to kind of break it down a little bit further, and some of the questions that you may not have thought to ask tonight. Once you see the film, you may be so inclined to ask at that point. Again, if you have questions, hit me up. Other than that, thank you for joining me. Again, this is Dr. Shantella Sherman with the Acumen Group and for Acumen Magazine. And this is Acumen's popular eugenics and television film teaser of Claudine and its eugenic themes. Thank you so much for joining me. And again, be blessed.